So there you see the Idaho-Washington line. Here's the Idaho-Montana line, and they're showing the ice right here, stopping right at the state line. Now when we go on tours, there's a place right here, the dam. There's a dam right here with an overlook, right where they say the ice dam was. Okay, so on my first trip out here in 98, I looked up, I called him before I went out. I looked for what geologists have done the most work up here in the area of the ice dam and up and down in the Clark Fork Valley. So I actually went and visited him at the university there in Moscow, Idaho, and went up to his office and lab and interviewed him for about an hour because I had not yet made my first traverse up the Clark Fork in 98. But I made my first within a day or a couple of days after meeting with the geologist. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk to him about, well, where was the ice dam? Now, typically, I know enough about glaciers to know that there's a marginal profile. And if there's water lapping at it, well, then icebergs will break off, and you couldn't get a shear wall. You could, right? But I wanted to know right where the ice dam was. I said, I want to go find the point right there where I can be going, okay, there was the lake, there was the ice dam. He couldn't tell me because he didn't know. And by the end of our conversation, he's kind of expressed something to me, and I wished. One of my great regrets is I had no means of recording it at the time. I didn't even know if I was going to be able to connect with him. So he was gracious enough to invite me in, and we had a very great conversation where he said to me he didn't really know what. I could tell basically he was not convinced that this model made sense. So I went away from there confident that I was on the right track. Went up there. I've made, half a dozen traverses up and down through the valley here. When Pardee wrote his second paper in 1942, he did a study right through this area right here, which is a narrow gap. And so what you're trying to do when you want to figure out discharge, you got to find a stretch where the conduit doesn't change a lot, right, from one end to the other. You know, you don't want it to change gradient steeply because that changes everything. You don't want it to, widen out, narrow. What you're looking for is a consistent valley width. So that's what he found right in here. We'll leave it at this. You can see here now, hopefully you can identify. Here's Moses Coulee, and here's the Coulee. You can see the Coulee monocline is right in here. And right here at the south end is Soap Lake. And that's where we stay when we do these tours out there. There's a resort there, Soap Lake Resort, right at the mouth of the Coulee. This expresses the attitude that became Robert R. Curry, 1977, Discussion in Glacial Geology of Flathead Valley and Catastrophic Drainage of Glacial Lake Missoula. And this is, you can see here what they're really trying to do. Erosion of the channel scablands thus becomes a more geologically reasonable consequence of the existence of outburst flooding near Pend Oreille, Idaho. It is really rather remarkable that it has taken the geological community this long to develop this picture of Lake Missoula floods, particularly due to the long-standing and highly controversial history of investigation of the channel scablands. Many highly creative, productive scientists have devoted an enormous number of publications to debate and elucidate these flood features. Particularly perplexing has been the lack of recognition of the possibility that the Purcell Trench ice dam would behave just as do other ice dams around the world. It now appears that, except for scale, the Lake Missoula floods are really a rather typical example of what is probably a rather common geological phenomena during times of maximum glacial advance. And this became the mindset. Oh, it's except for scale, that's nothing. Scale means nothing, right? Except for scale, it's just as we do other ice dams that we've seen them in Alaska, we've seen them in British Columbia, we've seen them in the Himalayas, we've seen them in Iceland. There's no reason why we should imagine that this is anything special or unique. This became the dominant view of the whole phenomena. And within that, that box kind of encapsulates the thinking. We don't go outside that box.
Stay in there, yeah.
Stay in that box. So this one's interesting. Oh, there it is, Breckenridge. Roy Breckenridge. Remember I said B? I had this B.
Yeah,
That's it,
yeah.
Breckenridge. Roy. Sorry, Roy. Didn't mean to forget your name, man. He's gone now.
Rest in peace.
I know. J. Harlan Bretz proposed in his own words an outrageous hypothesis that the erosional and depositional features in the channel scablands of eastern Washington were produced by catastrophic flooding. At that time, Bretz could not adequately explain a source for the floodwater other than to speculate upon a combination of events that included rapid melting and ablation of glacial ice combined with torrential rainfall. Now, I would argue that Bretz's original conceptions were far more realistic than the later paradigm. But then we have to, of course, look for an agency that could cause rapid melting and ablation of glacial ice and torrential rainfall. However, then John Elliott Allens and Marjorie Burns, in their book Cataclysms on the Columbia, said this: by 1925, after having published 4 papers on the scablands, all that Bretz could suggest as justification for his sudden and voluminous deluge was the possibility of increased runoff from glacial melt, from water welling out along the edge of the Cordilleran ice sheet and draining away across the southwest tilt of the Columbia Plateau. But the runoff Bretz proposed wasn't enough. Nothing but prodigious amounts of water could have formed the scablands' scarred and channeled features, and it was hard indeed to conceive of glacial melt achieving such a level of flooding. See, it's beginning. Yeah, and I would agree with that. Yes, it is. It's very hard to conceive of that much glacial melt. And this is why it scared the mainstream people away. They didn't want to go there. What if we did say that there was glacial melting on levels sufficient to trigger this flooding? Well, then what happens to glacial Lake Missoula? And how do we explain? Because, for one thing, in order to convert ice to water requires energy, doesn't it? Requires the input of energy. So then that raises the question of, well, where does the energy come from? Yeah, puzzles were added to puzzles. If the flood had resulted from excessive glacial melt, how could such a sudden, intense, and temporary melting be justified? An explanation was required, and Bretz, for lack of anything better, offered 2 rather far-fetched possibilities, improbable ones, but the best he could contrive. Either there had been a sudden and extreme but short-lived softening of the harsh Ice Age climate, or a gigantic Yokalaup had occurred, an under-glacier surge of ice-melting heat caused by volcanic activity. Both possibilities would have greatly increased the glacial melt-off, but, as Bretz well knew, there was no evidence that such climatic or volcanic events had occurred. Now, let's amend that last underlined statement. Yes, it is agreed that there's no evidence that volcanic events of sufficient power and magnitude had occurred to trigger this melting. However, as we now know, there have been 2 extreme warmings of the climate, bracketing the Younger Dryas, right? And associated with 2 gigantic meltwater pulses into the global ocean. It's there. Independently, there had to have been some climatic event to have caused meltwater pulse 1A and meltwater pulse 1B. Because the meltwater pulses, the rapid rising of sea level, is a direct evidence of rapid melting. Well, Glacial Lake Missoula model does not connect or explain any connection between rapid melting of the great ice sheets and catastrophic flooding. Pardee, 1942, published the results of his Lake Missoula study. He introduced evidence for an impoundment of 500, now it's 600, cubic miles of water behind an ice lobe that crossed the Clark Fork River in northern Idaho. other evidence indicated that the ice dam had suddenly failed. Now we'll get to what that other evidence is, releasing the impounded water. The water source for the catastrophic flood was no longer a problem. Yeah, we got it. Just a big lake. There's no reason. It's just not another typical. It's just bigger, but it's what we see. See, you can see what's happened here. We've got it explained. No problem. We've solved the problem here. Well, we solved the problem by, only looking through a narrow lens. Okay, so here is Missoula Basin and Mount Jumbo and Mount Sentinel flanking, right here, Mount Jumbo and Mount Sentinel flanking this valley right here, right outside the University of Montana campus there, right? So if we go there, you can see Mount Jumbo. You see the strand lines?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. There they are. I like this one because this is an old photograph, black and white, but you can see very clearly the snow that is accumulated on the strand lines because each of those was temporary shoreline. Now, here's the question. Do each of those strand lines represent a separate lake, or is it the draining of a single lake? Now, the draining, remember, picture in your mind the map of Lake Missoula, how intricate and complex it was. It's not going to be like draining a bathtub. You just pull the plug on one end and everything moves. You've got to go through constrictions, expansions. You've got to go around 180-degree turns. All of that is going to be causing a loss of energy, a slowing down of the water. So I'm just showing here strand lines left over from a single outburst draining of Ice Lake in Alaska. So here's the ice, here's the lake, and this is all mooring that you see here. And then once the lake drained away, you can see see the lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's left strand lines behind. Same thing here. This is Lake Como, western Montana. Strand lines formed as lake level dropped during a drought. This is not the result of the lake filling and draining multiple times. It's a single draining of the lake, but it was not consistently uniform over the whole process. It stalled at various elevations enough to etch a shoreline. There may have been a small rain or something that accumulated or whatever, but yeah, you can see here very clearly strand lines, and they are not yet within the mainstream view. Each of those shorelines is now associated with corresponding to one of the rhythmical layers
And how many strand lines are there on Mount Jumbo?
They've been counted. I counted them at one time. I don't remember. Let's see. That looks like the top one right there. Probably 30 or 40. That's a good question.